When Samantha Klopp became pregnant with her second child, everything was going as expected. However, when she went into labor, she had to be rushed to the operating room so that the doctors could try to save both her and the baby. When all hope seemed lost, her husband did something unbelievable. Craig and Samantha couldn't contain their joy when they discovered they were expecting their second baby. They had been trying for at least a year to conceive and give their son a sibling. Even their son, John, was asking for a little brother or sister. When they had the ultrasound that would reveal the baby's gender, Samantha asked the doctor not to tell them. Instead, the doctor wrote the result on a piece of paper and gave it to a friend of Samantha, who was in charge of organizing a small celebration with friends and family. The big reveal happened amidst sweets and a cake. When purple and pink balloons floated up and stuck to the ceiling of the apartment, indicating it would be a girl, everyone was emotional, but no one cried like Craig. He hugged his wife and son, kissing them both in the joy of realizing their dream. It was touching to see how excited the father was about his daughter's arrival, and as a Red Sox fan, he shouted, "I'm going to teach her how to play baseball too," eliciting laughter from everyone there. Craig met Samantha in college. He had gotten into a good university in the Boston area thanks to his talent as a batter. He had been the regional champion at 16 in the student league, and at 17, he caught the attention of scouts due to the large number of points he scored during that year's championship. He didn't end up becoming a professional player because of a shoulder injury, but throughout his years in college, he played for the university team. He always said that his best performance in sports was during a practice on campus. After hitting a ball and sending it skyward, Craig spotted Samantha, a very beautiful girl he had never seen there before. She was accompanied by a friend. "That was the best hit of my life because it brought me to you," Craig said to Samantha in his wedding vows, in front of all the guests. The ceremony was simple and elegant, held a year after Samantha's graduation. As an engineer, Craig traded his bat for a calculator but continued to follow the sport closely. When John was born, it was the greatest joy of his life. And by the time the boy was 3 years old, he was already hitting a ball with his father. Craig and Samantha had no expectations that their son would become an athlete like his father had been, but they enjoyed throwing balls in the yard and taking the boy to Red Sox games. Now that they were expecting a daughter, Craig and John would often lie in bed with Samantha, listening to the little girl kick and move. Everything seemed perfect, but the family would soon face a radical twist of fate. As the pregnancy neared the 40-week mark, Craig and Samantha reinforced their purchases to welcome her with all the comfort. A crib, clothes in every color, toys, and lots of diapers filled the room specially decorated for the baby. The due date was set for 10 days later. Since Samantha had been through this process before, she was calm, thinking she knew how everything would go. However, in the penultimate week, something unexpected happened. Samantha woke up and started feeling mild contractions. Since it didn't seem too serious, she and her husband went to the hospital without much concern. They just wanted to make sure everything was okay. During the consultation with the doctor, the contractions suddenly intensified and her water broke. That's when everything took a turn for the worse. Samantha felt very dizzy and nauseous. Since the contractions had interrupted her breakfast, she also felt weak. She hadn't experienced any of this when she gave birth the first time, but she still thought it might be nothing serious. Maybe it was just her daughter announcing her arrival earlier than expected. But Samantha was wrong. Minutes later, she fainted right in front of the doctor. Craig was terrified. He had never seen his wife in such a state, and not all the concentration of a batter prepared him for a situation like that. "What's going on? What's wrong with her?" he asked in vain as the team became agitated by the unforeseen situation. Samantha's heart rate dropped, and her blood pressure fell to 0. As time passed, while the doctor and nurses tried to understand what was happening, Samantha turned blue and seemed to be struggling to breathe. Soon, her body was placed on a bed connected to various machines that monitored her condition and that of the baby she was carrying. The problem was that the baby's vital signs also began to drop. Craig felt a chilling shiver down his spine. He could only watch in stunned silence, unable to do anything. The medical team knew they needed to act quickly and perform some additional tests. It was then that they finally confirmed Samantha was suffering from an amniotic fluid embolism. a rare allergic reaction that occurs when amniotic fluid enters the mother's bloodstream. This causes the heart and lungs to stop functioning. The woman was immediately taken to another part of the maternity ward, heading to the operating room. But there, the nurses didn't allow Craig to enter as well. He protested, saying he wanted to be near his wife and daughter at that moment, but the nurses insisted that the situation was too delicate and the doctors needed full concentration since there was a possibility she wouldn't survive. And if she did survive, Samantha would never be the same person again. Hearing this, Craig felt as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. Alone in the maternity corridor, he wanted to punch the walls until his fists bled, but instead, he crouched down and leaned his head against the wall. With all the strength he had, he began to speak softly to himself. Anyone who saw the scene didn't know if he was praying or just hoping for the best, but it was certainly a heartbreaking sight. Craig really needed to be strong, as he would soon face one of the most painful losses of his life. In the operating room, Samantha's condition became even more complicated, and nothing the medical team did was able to prevent the worst. At 10:20 that morning, Samantha was declared dead. Although it was a completely horrific situation for everyone there was no time to mourn. The team still wanted to save the baby. Meanwhile, Craig was outside, pacing back and forth. It was all too much for him. The two had spent the last few months preparing for the baby's arrival, planning what family life would be like, and dreaming of their baby's face. They hadn't even chosen a name yet. They wanted to look at their daughter and only then give her a name. And now he was there, alone, having to say goodbye to the woman he met by chance 10 years ago, thanks to a baseball game. Craig felt powerless and scared. He had never gone through anything like this and was in shock. Even so, he tried to keep his head clear. His daughter was still fighting, and he wouldn't give up as long as there was a 1% chance of turning the situation around. He couldn't let his wife go without a fight. Craig then faced the challenge in the only way he could. He knelt down and made the most painful and honest request of his life. "I know this is more than I can bear, and maybe it's more than I can ask for. Maybe this means there's a plan for me and a purpose in all this. That's what I'm going to trust in. Just let me hold my wife one more time. That's all I ask," Craig said, on the floor of that corridor. He was a desperate man. He then stood up and called his family and friends, asking them all to come to the maternity ward without delay. When everyone was in the waiting room, they held hands and reinforced their prayers and pleas for Samantha and the baby. The prayers even reached the social media pages of those people, and soon, even those who didn't know Samantha or Craig were showing support for the family, hoping everything would turn out well. After the prayers, everyone chose a corner to wait for better news. Samantha was still in the operating room, and the doctors were fighting to revive her in one last desperate attempt. Fortunately, the team caring for the baby managed to save the little girl. She was born crying weakly, but the important thing was that she was taken out of her mother and would live. Despite this victory, it was still unclear if the newborn could be comforted by her own mother on her first day in this world. Craig cried and laughed at the same time as he held his daughter in his arms. The feeling was indescribable, for better or worse. He had heard of experiences like this, capable of confusing our logic and overwhelming our senses, but only now did he understand what it really meant and how difficult it was to explain. In those few minutes he had to look at the girl. He had no doubts about what to name her. Grace, that's what she would be called. Craig was happy to have his little Grace, but the fear of losing his wife at the same time was like a shadow threatening to ruin all the joy. Fate then decided to bet on the hope of the former athlete, and soon the doctor appeared to give the news. Samantha had responded to the last resuscitation attempt. She still had a weak pulse, but she was breathing again. The doctor said no one knew how it had happened, but the fact was that they would now do everything to stabilize her. Craig hugged the family and friends who were around. Hearing those words felt like a ton of anguish had been lifted from his shoulders. The doctors transferred Samantha to the ICU, where they did everything possible to keep her breathing. However, she began to show a decline in vital signs again. Samantha's brother, who was a surgeon, arrived at the hospital and asked to see her records. He knew that this wasn't good and that the risks were extreme. His sister was in cardiovascular collapse. He himself went to the waiting room and explained to everyone what was happening. It was a very sad and frightening moment. Craig then stood up, looked at his newborn daughter, and decided to enter his wife's room in the ICU. While doctors and nurses checked records, monitored the situation through graphs on screens, and administered medications, the engineer approached Samantha and took her hand. "I love you and always will. Grace is already with me, and she's beautiful and perfect. If you still have any strength to fight, please fight." Craig's faith in his wife's recovery was strong, but Samantha's condition didn't change. Even after 2 blood transfusions, her condition was still considered critical. Her heart was failing, pumping less and less blood to her body. Her lungs had stopped working. She was breathing through machines. Samantha was unconscious and cold. At any moment, she could take her last breath, but one of the doctors noticed something that had been overlooked. Reevaluating one of the tests and looking at the patient's condition, he noticed that one of the organs had been accidentally cut and was still bleeding, something they hadn't noticed. So, on the brink of being declared deceased for the second time, she was taken back to the operating room, but this time to another hospital. It was a better-equipped complex for that situation and had a machine that would assist in extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, restoring the functions of the heart and lungs. They also lowered the level of sedation to the point where Samantha regained consciousness so they could assess her neurological functions. When Craig saw his wife showing signs of life again, he returned to the room and stood right in her line of sight. He took her hand in his and said, "Hi, my love," with a hopeful smile. Though confused and weakened, Samantha smiled back and let a tear fall. The doctors hadn't expected a reaction like that after all she had been through. Her brain not only hadn't died, but her neurological functions were better preserved than usual. It was at that moment that Craig realized there was a way to truly save Samantha. The doctors then announced they would attempt a new surgery and that she would soon be put under anesthesia. Quickly, Craig brought Grace in a rush and placed the newborn in Samantha's arms, allowing mother and daughter to touch for the first time. "Her name is Grace, my love. Our daughter is here, alive. We'll be here when you wake up," Craig said, choked with emotion. Samantha was very weak, but the expression on her face and in her eyes completely changed. Seeing and feeling her daughter seemed to awaken something inside the woman and restore her strength. Samantha was determined to keep fighting for her life. But as soon as the anesthesiologist administered the substance, Samantha became unconscious again. All Craig could do was take care of Grace and wait. John was at his grandparents' house, completely unaware of the danger his mother was in. The entire ordeal was the hardest test of faith and resilience that Craig and many of his friends and family had ever faced. But at last, the surgery was over, and Samantha's condition was miraculously stabilized. By that point, the doctors were exhausted and puzzled. How did a woman's body manage to face death and the birth of a life at the same time? Craig cried with relief. On the phone, he could hardly deliver the good news to his parents because he was still trembling. Now they could finally come to the maternity ward to meet Grace and bring her brother along. 24 hours later, the ventilator was removed, and Samantha breathed on her own again. Only a few hours later, Craig, John, and little Grace were able to talk to her. The woman was exhausted, but she didn't remember much. Even without strength and with a heavy head, she wanted to hold her daughter in her arms again. Craig helped her, placing the child in her lap. When Grace opened her little eyes, and her gaze met her mother's for the first time, a tear rolled down Samantha's cheek, washing away all the anguish that had filled the place moments before. Craig sat beside his wife and whispered a thank you to heaven. If you like the story, please give it a thumbs up. And this other video that's popping up on the screen now will probably move you too. Enjoy the session and see you in the next video.